Love him or hate him, Donald Trump has never been one to shy away from controversy, especially when it comes to international affairs. One of his most controversial stands, his resistance to Ukraine joining NATO. But why is Trump so against it? Does his opposition have more to do with power than peace? It's not just about politics, it's about power, alliances, and a bold vision for America's place in the world. Let's start with the most recent reports. Last week, Trump's negotiations with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky blew up.
Russia. I don't want a ceasefire. You don't have the cards right now.
The most controversial part? The White House reportedly proposed a rare earth mining deal in place of the security guarantees Zelensky has been demanding to support any peace agreement with Russia. But what about a defense strategy if Russia violates a ceasefire? The United States has been somewhat reluctant to make a commitment. But before exploring why Donald Trump doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO, let's find out what NATO is and why it was even set up. Well, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was established in the year 1949 in Washington, D.C. Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States were among the original 12 founding nations. Now, fast forward to today, and NATO has expanded into a large organization with 32 member nations from North America and Europe. Following the fall of the Soviet Union in the year 1991, more Eastern European nations chose to join the squad, so it's no longer only the original 12. As the conflict between Russia and Ukraine continues to escalate, Trump's hesitation to back Ukraine's NATO membership has drawn criticism. Does it reflect a sincere concern for the alliance's stability, or is it a calculated move to please Russia? The chances of Ukraine joining NATO seem to be fading. While the previous United States government subtly resisted Ukraine's request to join the alliance, the new administration isn't holding back. It's made its opposition loud and clear. Trump recently said that Ukraine could forget about joining NATO. Why? Perhaps those ambitions have only added fuel to the fire with Russia. Before his in-person meeting, Trump had a conversation with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky for an hour. The same day, Trump also had a more than hour-long chat with Russian President Vladimir Putin, which he described as fruitful. The Kremlin stated that Trump and Putin had reached an agreement to meet with Saudi Arabia or Moscow as possible locations. Throughout his presidency, Trump frequently questioned the value of NATO, criticizing its member countries for failing to contribute to defense spending. His foreign policy often felt like a business deal. Military assistance was not guaranteed and seemed to be based on what the United States could get in return. It was a sharp, transactional strategy that made many allies wonder about the future of their partnerships. Trump paused military assistance to Ukraine after a heated clash with Zelensky. The action was taken just hours after he criticized the Ukrainian leader for not wanting peace. Trump's move to suspend the flow of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of ammunition and weapons is a major blow to Ukraine as it fights Russia's incursion. The United States has upped its funding up to this point. Military aid is expected to reach $920 million per month this year, a significant increase from $500 million in the year 2024. Zelensky has openly stated that Ukraine has a very low chance of survival without American support. Ukraine was barely surviving as the Russians continued to make costly but continuous advances on their front lines. Without United States military aid, Ukrainian forces will gradually lose combat capability, said Mark Kansian, a senior consultant with CSIS and a former colonel in the United States Marine Corps. He continued, "They might be able to hold out for 2 to 4 months before the Russians break through their defenses. In my opinion, Trump's frustration with Zelensky's admission that peace with Russia is still very, very far away is what led to this low point in the United States-Ukraine ties, which further widened the gap between the two presidents. Trump didn't hold back on social media, alleging that Zelensky didn't want peace. Tensions reached a boiling point as Trump blasted Zelensky's most recent comments as the worst statement that could have been made on his Truth social media network. He stated bluntly, as usual, "America will not tolerate it for much longer. I've been saying this all along. This man doesn't want peace as long as America supports him." The frustration didn't end there. Later that day, at a press briefing, Trump stepped up his criticism of Zelensky. He accused Zelensky of showing little gratitude for the massive aid the United States had provided over the past 3 years since Russia's full-scale invasion. Things took an even more dramatic turn when Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance publicly challenged Zelensky in front of cameras during a high-profile argument at the White House. They were clearly angry. At one point, Vance yelled, "Just say thank you." It was a moment that exposed the widening gap between the president of Ukraine and the US leadership. He has openly expressed trust in Putin, labeled Zelensky a dictator, and even gone so far as to say that Ukraine, not Russia, started the war. Trump's comments have shocked allies in the West. Meanwhile, leaders from Europe gathered in London for a summit and decided on a 4-point strategy to support Ukraine's defense in the event that a peace agreement with Russia is ever reached. But Trump wasn't impressed. Just days after his tense meeting with Zelensky, he questioned whether the summit was a true message to Russia. Setting Trump's opposition aside, the question still stands. Does Ukraine meet NATO's requirements? Since NATO has an open-door policy, any nation can join if all 32 members unanimously agree. A candidate should demonstrate a solid commitment to democracy and a robust market economy. They also need to ensure civilian oversight of the military, honor the sovereignty of other nations, and be ready to align their forces with NATO standards. The process starts with a membership action plan, which is a list of suggestions for prospective members. When Ukraine applied for the map in 2008, then US President George W. Bush enthusiastically supported the country's first move. But the dream was quickly shattered. NATO members, especially Germany and France, shut down Ukraine's ambitions under intense pressure from Russian President Vladimir Putin. The tides shifted years later. With a newfound sense of urgency, Kiev found itself back on the path toward Euro-Atlantic integration when Russia invaded Ukraine and took control of Crimea as well as portions of Donetsk and Luhansk. Prior to the war, the majority of Ukrainians preferred neutrality over joining a military force. At the time, there wasn't much support for joining NATO. But as the war began, the situation drastically changed. Public support for joining NATO soared to over 80% by 2022 as the war intensified, indicating the country's rising desire for security assurances. Ukraine formally sought accelerated NATO entry in late 2022. By 2023, NATO leaders even removed the need for new members to submit a membership action plan, which is normally required. Yet, in spite of these developments, Kyiv was not invited to join the alliance. This stands in stark contrast to Finland and Sweden, who are geographically close to Russia but managed to secure their invitations. In the words of Professor Mark Weber, an expert in international relations, Ukraine is an unusual case, a large pro-NATO country eager to join, yet unable to gain the unanimous support needed for membership. Is Russia strengthening its hold on the Western Bloc and influencing NATO's position on Ukraine to serve its own interests? Moscow first used an alleged NATO threat to defend its invasion of Ukraine, and it has since made Ukraine's exclusion from NATO a top priority in any future peace agreement. There are differing views within NATO. Ukraine's membership is seen as essential for regional security by nations including the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Poland, and the Baltic states. However, major nations like Germany and the United States, as well as Hungary and Slovakia, continue to reject it. Germany has a long history of diplomacy and is often cautious of provoking Russia. Viktor Orban and Robert Fico, the leaders of Hungary and Slovakia, are fiercely against Ukraine joining NATO because they believe it will worsen relations with Russia. The United States continues to be the biggest barrier. The current government has made it clear that Ukraine has no desire to join NATO and is unlikely to obtain any legally binding security assurances. This position emphasizes how difficult it is for Ukraine to negotiate the complex dynamics of NATO diplomacy, where Russia's influence permeates every choice. But the big question remains, does Trump's position make sense, or is he simply playing politics? Let us know what you think in the comments. Should Ukraine be allowed into NATO, or is Trump onto something?